My memories of Karachi in the 90s was like Mr. Burger. So anyone who's a Karachiite and knows.
Having chai is like having a heart-to-heart with someone without realizing you're having a heart-to-heart with them. And that's what I've been doing these last few months with Pakistani diaspora all over the world. I want to welcome you to season 1 of Shaam Ki Chai. Assalamualaikum everyone, my name's Natasha and welcome to another episode of Shaam Ki Chai, where I go behind the scenes with amazing Pakistani diaspora all over the world. And today we have the infamous Kalsoom Lakhani with us. Thank you so much, Kalsoom, for joining us. She is the founder and CEO of Invest to Innovate and I Ventures, Invest to Innovate Ventures, and we're just going to be diving right in. So to kick us off, Kalsoom, you had mentioned earlier that you were born in Dubai, but I'd love to learn more about what part of Pakistan your family is from and when did you move out to the US?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a complicated question for me. My dad is from Karachi. My mom's actually not from Pakistan. My mom's from Bangladesh. And so my mom's from Dhaka. So I moved from Dubai to Dhaka when I was in elementary school. So I have a lot of early formative childhood years in Bangladesh and then moved to Pakistan. Though my dad is from Karachi, my mom's one condition to my dad when we were moving to Pakistan was that Karachi in the 90s was very dangerous. So she didn't want to move. We were already being uprooted anyway from being really close to where our family lives. So she wanted to move to a place that was at least safe. So we moved to Islamabad. And so even though that's not where my dad is from, Islamabad is home for me. And that's where I spent my middle and high school years. And I graduated from high school from the international school in Islamabad and moved to the US for university.
Got it. That's awesome. And so what are some of like your early memories or some of your favorite memories from your time in Pakistan?
So growing up or like just generally, because obviously I'm there so often.
Growing up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess like for those who are Karachiites, for me, when I was in Dhaka and we'd go to Karachi and visit our family, my memories of Karachi in the 90s was like Mr. Burger. So anyone who's a Karachiite and knows like, and is close to my age knows that Mr. Burger was really famous. So like remembering like moments like that. For me, Islamabad and growing up was so formative for me. So for me, it was like, the mountains and I did, when I was 16, it was the first time we did this like major road trip up to the Chinese border. And that was before a lot of the infrastructure that's now there. And I just recently did that trip last year, which was amazing because you have all the highways that are done. But back then it wasn't, and none of that existed. So we went, all the way up to the Chinese border and stopped in Gilgit and Gulmit and all these places. And so for me, Pakistan in general, but also Islamabad, because of so much natural beauty around you, that's probably some of the most amazing things. And then obviously Islamabad has a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a boring city compared to other cities in Pakistan. But for me, it was just a really amazing place to grow up. And some of my best friends are still there and people that I grew up with are still some of my best friends today.
That's amazing. That's incredible. So then you moved out to the US, the East Coast, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you went to university. And you have a background in public policy and government, correct?
Yes, foreign policy. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's awesome. So it seems like, I was reading up on your background and from very, very early on, you've actually been involved in the Pakistani ecosystem quite a bit. I'm sure that must be frustrating at times, but what drives you to be so passionate about helping out over there?
So, I didn't get involved in the startup ecosystem. The startup ecosystem in Pakistan didn't even exist when I was graduating from college, which was like 2004. So I just aged myself. But I was always interested in Pakistan more from a foreign policy lens when I was in college. And then I went to graduate school for foreign policy as well. And that's, for me at the time, that's how I thought I was going to affect change, was because of, feeling really, I was in college so soon. I was in college when 9/11 happened, right? So wow. For me, that was really formative in being a politics major, in also being someone who is Muslim in America. Like, what is my role and responsibility in telling a better narrative, and also having the role of ultimately, like, without meaning to, all of us still today are almost accidental ambassadors, right? And so for me at the time, post-college and graduate school, the way that lens showed up was through foreign policy. And I worked in strategic communications and I was an analyst. I ended up starting a current affairs blog while I was working on Pakistan at the time that was telling a different narrative of Pakistan than what people were seeing in the news media, that got relatively big at the time. And then all of that fell into eventually me starting Invest to Innovate. But that was after when I was 29. So, and that was, aging it myself again, that was 9 years ago. So Pakistan has always been where my heart has been in terms of just like, even though obviously for me, Bangladesh as well is very much home because that's literally my motherland. But, and I've told a lot of the stories of 1971, and that's been a lot of how I've examined my own identity was through 71. And telling the stories of 71 to Pakistanis has been a really important part of my own journey. And then with Pakistan, from a foreign policy lens, that was how I started my career. And then eventually it went into the startup landscape and things like that. But Pakistan has always kind of been the center of all of that.
That's incredible. And so what were your thoughts when you were starting Invest to Innovate? It started in 2011, I believe. What impact were you wanting to make with Invest to Innovate?
I think at the time, so for us, the why statement at Invest to Innovate, and I have my mug here with my chai, yes. So my intention when I started Eye to Eye was, ultimately came from a belief that the next great innovators aren't coming from Silicon Valley. They're coming from places like Pakistan and Nigeria and Vietnam and all of these places that are considered, these frontier markets. But really don't have the infrastructure or the environment. And there was a lot of barriers for amazing young people that are, want to create change around them, want to create entrepreneurial solutions for the problems that they see around them. There's just a lot of barriers for that, right? So Invest to Innovate was really started with that notion of how do we actually unleash that potential that exists in growth markets. And we started in Pakistan because that's what I knew. It's where I had a network already. And then when we started in Pakistan, the Pakistani startup ecosystem was very, very new. It was like basically non-existent. There was obviously things that were already happening, but it was very few and far between back then. And so when we started, for me, it was realizing really quickly that rather than being in many countries at once, there was more value in going deep into one startup ecosystem and really truly providing value there. So to your question, Natasha, I think that when I started Invest Innovate, that why statement was always the same, and it's always been the same. But the way that we've done our work and expressed our work has changed a lot over the last 9 years.
That's awesome. And so what sort of similarities and differences do you see in these growth markets? So from my understanding, you guys are in places like, you've helped areas like Vietnam, Cambodia, Nepal, and Bangladesh, in addition to Pakistan. And so what are some trends there, and what are the differences between these areas?
Yeah, and it's been really fun. So altogether, we've worked with about 42 incubators and accelerators. So about 28 that are in Pakistan, and then we've worked with a number that have been in other markets. So while we haven't been doing the same kind of work that we do in Pakistan, what we realized, and this actually started to happen really quickly, was that as I was working in Pakistan, other startup ecosystems started to come up around the same time, right? So Bangladesh, obviously I have a strong network there. My family is all still in Dhaka. There are people that are kind of leading the startup ecosystem. There are a few of them are guys that I went to elementary school with, right? And so they reached out. Two of them reached out to me, and I actually was just on the phone with one of them last night because we were talking about similar companies that we're looking to invest in both of our different markets, right? And so they just messaged me one day and they're like, "We love what you're doing in Pakistan. Can you come help us in what we're doing here in Bangladesh?" And so that's what started me starting to do that work. But then realizing about 2 years ago, I was in Singapore, and I was there for an Australian government project that brought incubators and accelerators from across Asia Pacific into one place. And we were one of the partners that was there to train. And the most amazing thing that I realized really quickly was that so much of the knowledge that I had of being in an early startup ecosystem was extremely transferable, regardless of whether you were from Fiji, because there were guys from Fiji that we had these amazing conversations with, whether you were in Vietnam. So there is a sameness that exists in a lot of our markets and how people behave. A lot of it's very trust-based. It's very relational. A lot of the challenges are the exact same. And so there was a lot of knowledge as well as the mistakes that we made early on with Eye to Eye that we could actually help other people not make those mistakes by supporting them early on, right? So that's kind of how the work began in those markets. And, I think we're realizing now, like, starting to speak to people in the Middle East as well, is like, there's so much sameness. I think we always talk about our differences, and I just think that there's so many similarities, and I've always seen things that way. So it's been really fun to work in other countries. That's well.
Awesome. Are you seeing some trends in terms of products that are coming out of those areas?
Yeah. And basically you can see the exact same trends. So everything, if you look at Indonesia, so right now, I think the most exciting market in Southeast Asia is Indonesia, and Vietnam. But Jakarta is like considered this hub of all these amazing companies that are coming up, like Gojek, which is an on-demand for motorbikes. There's so many companies coming up in the edtech space. Like, I mean, Indonesia is like huge. And then in the Middle East, obviously, like, there's a lot happening in MENA, but Cairo specifically in Egypt, like you're seeing so much happen, right? And so what I find really interesting is that you see the exact same startups come up in all of those markets. So you see people in the e-commerce space, you see then players that are trying to address challenges that exist in the supply chain for e-commerce. You see players that are in mobility. You see players that are in ed tech and health tech and telehealth. So I have literally in Pakistan, every single model that I've looked at from an investment lens right now, I have seen almost the exact same model in another market. And so like last night, I just said I was on the phone with my friend Samad. I literally can just pick up the phone and be like, hey, tell me more about this company that came up in Dhaka. I want to learn more about what's happening there so I can kind of understand a little bit more about the nuances and see how we can apply it to Pakistan or the other way, right? Like what's been happening in Pakistan can be applied elsewhere as well, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I think the sad part is what I've realized in our work in the region is that we don't speak to each other enough, right? And especially Pakistan and Bangladesh, because of a lot of political issues right now, we genuinely don't speak to each other. I was in Nepal and, people like, it's just so landlocked and it's so difficult logistically to get from Nepal to Pakistan, right? So we don't speak to one another. And so realizing in a lot of ways, it's like, I'm someone who's pretty extroverted and I love building really great relationships. So just the ability to say like, pick up the phone and call someone and be like, hey, can I connect you to this amazing entrepreneur in Pakistan? Can we do this? All of that is kind of what has been how I've operated for the last decade, basically.
That's awesome. Well, do you think now, because of the tech wave coming into these countries, you will see more collaboration because of it?
In certain places. So in Bangladesh, you're seeing a lot happen between Bangladesh and Southeast Asia because of the location, because it's, so close. Like Dhaka to Bangkok is like such a quick flight. You're seeing even just recently Shop Up in Bangladesh just raised $22.5 million from Sequoia and Omidyar. And that was mainly from Sequoia, India. And what they did was that they were able to merge with an Indian company, leverage Indian talent. But the challenge with Pakistan is that we can't, India is right there, right? So it's like we have a major challenge with, and I remember this in the early days of Eye to Eye, like there was an amazing Indian entrepreneur, Manoj Singh from Hess Power Systems. And he was like telling me, he's like, can we just like, can we somehow license our stuff and bring it to Pakistan? And there's just no way to do it, right? And that kind of acts as like a limitation there. So I think with Pakistan, there's a lot of opportunities right now with the Middle East. So we're seeing a lot of those potential things happening. There is potential, but I just think it takes a lot of activist work. So you have to, like the way in Bangladesh is like naturally happening because investors are very opportunistically from Southeast Asia looking at Bangladesh, and they are starting to do that for Pakistan as well. But as an investor in the market, we have to be a little bit more activist about reaching out and creating those linkages as well, because it's not sometimes the most natural thing for people to look at Pakistan and realize, it comes across as, as very high risk. And so people don't necessarily know how to understand the market. They don't know how to invest. They don't know how to come in. So you have to kind of play that role as ambassador ultimately.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so that actually branches into a piece you recently wrote about censorship in Pakistan, and how that impacts sort of the investment landscape. And so what balance do you think the government needs to strike? You have to appease a certain population of Pakistanis on one end, but you also can't hinder innovation and investing either. And so what kind of balance do you think the government is going to need to strike there? And how will that happen?
Yeah. So in that piece, what I wrote was that there's a difference between banning content and banning platforms, right? And so content is typically like every single country in the world has some sort of parameters on what content that they ban, right? So in China, there are going to be certain pictures that are just from Shutterstock that will just not show up in China. There is going to be things in Bangladesh, they actually did ban TikTok briefly and then reopened it because of similar things. Indonesia did the same thing. The thing with Pakistan, the challenge isn't that content can't be regulated, right? Because it is, I think the reality is that Pakistan is a conservative country, right? We do have a very big population of people that will feel offended by certain things. And I don't think we should fight against that. If anything, we should say, like, how do we navigate against that and have those conversations? But the reality is that Section 37 of this act that's in place for the Electronic Crimes Act is very draconian in the way that it's written. And so it allows any kind of content or any platform to be banned without real, like, reasoning given to it, right? So it's like if there's a reason to it, it's very like loose, and there isn't a sense of like, for all of us who are even investors in the space. So I've invested in a social communications platform, right? So I've invested in a localized messenger. Technically, we should be celebrating if TikTok is banned because that's great for our platform, right? But we're not, because there's nothing that actually stops in the law. There's nothing, they're not banning TikTok because it's foreign. They're banning TikTok because it's supposedly allowing for indecent content. And because we don't know what that indecent, the line is, and who's judging those parameters, it's really difficult from a risk perspective to even know, like, should any platform be allowed? Because they even they briefly banned PUBG, which is a gaming platform, because they felt like kids were getting addicted, right? Mm-hmm. So if we can just ban everything, then there is no sense of like there creates a real sense of instability and uncertainty, and that's the one thing for investors you never want, right? Is that they're already, as you know, when you're in venture capital, it's already so risky, it's already so uncertain. If you add this like very top down element to it, it really doesn't allow for, it doesn't make any investor feel good, right? It doesn't allow anyone to say that we're going to invest in innovation. And so I think banning content is a reality, and that's going to happen in every market to a certain degree. Banning platforms is another thing, and that's specifically the language around Section 37. There's been efforts to try to clarify it. There's been efforts to try to like push the government to clarify the language, and it still hasn't been done yet. So that's really the issue there, and is things that are coming across as draconian in the way that things are being administered.
Okay. And so now that you've brought up TikTok and different platforms, what's interesting about these platforms, and you actually said this in your article, that they allow everyone from a man named Hulu who earns 600 rupees a day, but has over millions of followers, to, Rumaisa Khan, a university student who has nearly 3 million followers, to become a creator. And that obviously allows people to have a revenue stream. Like there's a lot of classism in Pakistan. And so you had a very distinct upper, middle, and lower class. And now all of that can change in terms of how someone is earning income. And although that helps the economy, that also gives, rise to a platform for people that do have a more conservative viewpoint to sort of vocalize themselves, right? And not that that's right or wrong, but that's just there. And so now with things like the Aurat March movement coming in and more religious policing, how do you think Pakistan's going to navigate this and balance between the two?
I mean, that's Pakistan's age-old problem, right? Like, I think we're constantly navigating these two very distinct ideas of what the country is and what the country should be. I think when it comes to, so with TikTok, just as an example, just a clarification, there is really no monetization yet with the platform, but there will be monetization eventually, right? It's something that will exist. And so I think, sorry, I'm just shutting off my FaceTime.
It's okay.
Decline. Okay. So basically what I think is interesting is that the reason why that's important is because and why in the article I talk about the YouTube ban, right? Is because the YouTube ban and talking about the ramifications of it. So at the time when YouTube was banned in Pakistan, there wasn't necessarily a monetization yet. Like the creator ecosystem was still very, very new, but in banning it for 3 years, it actually halted the growth of what that creator ecosystem looked like. And with TikTok, it hasn't really happened yet in terms of like that, that gentleman, Hulu, or the guy who's like a tribesman in Waziristan. They're not monetizing their TikTok, but basically they're becoming creatives, right? Which is such an important piece of that value chain. And so Pakistan, in terms of your bigger question, I mean, we're always going to be navigating that because I think as a country, we still have never really had like a very strong vision about who we are. And I think, that's a bigger philosophical debate about Pakistan itself, right? Of why we were set up and who's been leading the country and how we've become increasingly more conservative and allowed those voices that are, even if they are a minority or they're a majority now, we don't never know, right? But it's like, we're always listening to that voice. And so, but you could argue, I'm in the US, like you could argue that here about the right-wing conservatives as well, right? It's like, who do you listen to when it comes to things? And so for me, the push for free speech in Pakistan and the push against censorship allows for real, like TikTok and these platforms allows for real creative expression, right? And allows for that to exist. And if we, if the government allows for that free form expression to be, not have like indecent and all of that stuff, because that's just going to go against the religion. But I also think that helps challenge norms. It helps challenges people's concepts. There's someone who's a transgender, a hijra in Pakistan that has a ton of followers on TikTok. And how amazing, right? Like for someone like that to be able to have a platform, and by virtue of someone who might be more conservative, by seeing that content, maybe they'll be offended first, but maybe that allows that bridge of understanding that should exist, right? Like we exist in these echo chambers and these silos. And if we're not allowing for content to exist, we're not allowing for people to change their minds about things. So, that's a bigger discussion, I guess.
That's really interesting. So then how do you think that type of individualized content creators will start impacting more mainstream Pakistani media?
I think we're seeing that a little bit right now. I think a lot of people look down, and this is the case in India. So Pakistan yet, we still haven't, it's still an early, TikTok is still early, but it's actually like one of the fastest growing social apps. But in India, this is the biggest, most interesting thing is that it is a class thing, right? So I think you are seeing like in India, TikTok is banned, but TikTok was extremely huge. There's a reason why there's all these copycat apps that are now operating in the absence of TikTok. But what's really interesting, there was this article that was done by this journalist, Nilesh Christopher, for Rest of World. And him and I actually had a conversation afterwards because I was like messaged him on Twitter. I was like, this was so interesting to me. Because it's a lower socioeconomic class in India, as is the case in Pakistan as well. What's interesting is that that's not who people care about as a voice, right? And so if that voice was maybe able to, organize themselves in a better way, if they became a movement or in some way, whatever, maybe that would be different. But that's also one of the arguments right now about why the TikTok ban for a little while was able to stay, because it's an audience that the Facebook, Instagram audience and Twitter audience in Pakistan is a much more educated elite, right? So if that's why Twitter won't be banned, right? Because a lot of these political elites use Twitter, right? But those guys are not on TikTok. And so this audience is not someone that has a representative voice in politics or in these big media, mainstream media. So there's a lot of derisiveness. There's a lot of condescension that goes towards like what is being created on there. And that's their loss, to be honest, but it is a reflection of a very classist attitude that exists in the country.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So switching gears here a little bit. So you have a partner, Ms. Van Naqvi, for Eye to Eye and Eye to Eye Ventures. And I'm sure, I know raising capital for a venture fund is hard, period. Now you're two women trying to raise capital for a venture fund that invests in Pakistani, startups. That must be like a docuseries waiting to happen.
Yeah. How much time do you have?
What I want to say. So why don't you tell us a little more about some of like the most memorable moments you've had while trying to build this? I'm sure it hasn't been easy.
Yeah. So I've been a solo founder for Invest to Innovate. So the last 9 years, Eye to Eye they're two sister entities. So just to clarify, so Mispa and I have been partners on the fund, and that's what we're building together. But she's actually been an advisor to Eye to Eye for the last 9 years. So since day one of Eye to Eye, we've known each other for the last 10 years. So building the fund is something that started to happen about a couple of years ago, really. I had been building Eye to Eye for a number of years. I mean, for me, some of the best stories that come out of Eye to Eye all revolve around our entrepreneurs. Like we just have worked with some of the best founders over the last 9 years. And we do this amazing retreat in the beginning of all of our accelerators. We take our founders up to the mountains in Pakistan.
Wow.
We do an entire retreat that's completely, we just offline. It's very much a curriculum that I designed from scratch. That's all around vulnerability. It's all around storytelling and really kind of building the community in that first weekend. And some of my favorite memories are that first weekend of all of our classes. I have built such amazing relationships with people. And I mean, some of my favorite memories are like, one of our founders who she's amazing and she's like doing so well right now. But I remember on the first weekend of that program, she was really quiet through the whole thing. And her co-founder, Zubair, this is a shout out to Farida. She was, someone who was really shy and quiet. And then towards the end of the weekend, she just started to pitch. She started to speak out more. She was pitching. And Zubair was the one like supporting. And at the end, when we do this thing called a power circle at the end of our first weekend and the end of our last weekend before they pitch to investors, but where you go around the circle and you tell the person on your left one thing that you really appreciate and are grateful for about them. And it's always super powerful, right? Because in Pakistan, these are not things that we do, like this expression of emotions, right?
That just doesn't happen in Desi culture.
Doesn't happen, right? No. And we just turn it on its head and we just say like men, women, we're going to have these amazing breakthroughs. And Zubair said to me, he's like, I don't know what jadoo you did on Farida, what magic you've done on her, but like she's become this different person, right? And just those moments of breakthroughs are my favorite moments. The hardest thing for the fund now is like, it's really fun to now be an investor on the other side of things, having complained about investors for a number of years.
Awesome.
But also like, I think some of the hardest parts for Mispa and I, number one is that, I didn't put myself in the arena as an investor for a very long time. Like I was building Eye to Eye. I was someone that was working with companies and getting them ready for investment. I was working closely with local investors. But then on the other side of it, I just never thought I could be an investor. I don't have a traditional finance background. And I just didn't think I just thought it was too audacious for me to believe I could do that. And then I remember there was one friend of mine or one mentor that I met that literally was like, why aren't you doing this? Like, startups so well, you've built companies with them, you're a founder yourself. And I remember just being like, oh yeah, like it didn't occur to me, right? Like that I could do it. And so it's crazy now because as you said, like, it's so hard as women to build it. We get underestimated and doubted all the time, right? And we are by far out of all the funds in the market, we have had the longest experience working with startups in the market, right? And so there should be no reason that we're doubted. And yet like we get asked ridiculous questions on a regular basis. And we're told we're too soft. We're told we're, you're too nice. I'm always told I'm too nice and it's never in a positive way. So there's a lot of things that you just have these moments of being like, this is just, it's an uphill battle, but I could not do it with anyone but my partner. Like having been a solo founder for so long and now having a co-founder on the fund. I honestly like this journey without her. She's my partner, but she's also my like work wife. She's like a dear friend of mine and family. And so we have each other's back. And so I think without her, I would not be able to do this. And without so many people around us that have been supporting us through this process.
That's incredible. Are you seeing a shift in the kinds of founders that are coming out of Pakistan? Are you seeing more women going into entrepreneurship or is it still skewed heavily male?
It depends on what sector you're looking at. So,
Okay.
I mean, we've graduated close to 50 companies with our accelerator. And obviously, so we have our accelerator program, and then we have a bunch of training programs that we run right now with the World Bank and with Facebook and all of that. Mm-hmm. So with our program, we've graduated nearly 50 companies. That's our flagship program. It's a little bit more curated every year. That's the one where we go on a retreat every year. And that's had 60% of our companies have been female founded companies. Nice. And that doesn't necessarily speak to the pipeline. It might speak to the design of our program because we're women. There's so many women that work in our company. We're majority women in our company. We design for that anyway, right? We think about in this last accelerator class that we had, Marilyn, who is part of it, had just given birth 3 months before. And she was saying that if she had been in another program, she wouldn't have even asked if she could have participated, right? But she just brought Jasmine with her every weekend. And we do 6 weekends over 4 months, right? And then we're also right now, we're running a boot camp that's training about 300 women-led companies now over the course of a year and a half. We've already trained about 150 so far. Okay. And so we are seeing a lot of women. The challenge right now in Pakistan is that we're not seeing enough women raise capital. So we're seeing a lot of women-led companies, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We see that in global numbers as well. So in Pakistan, companies have raised $192 million over the last 5 years in the startup ecosystem. Only 3% has been by female founded or co-founded companies. And typically what we see is that female led companies raise, angel seed really early. We haven't seen a Series A close yet. I think it'll happen soon. And so I think as a result of that, there needs to be a lot of support and handholding. So actually yesterday we just launched applications for a brand new program. It's a World Bank program that we're implementing that we designed. And it's basically really designed for how do we close that gap? Why is this happening? And how do we actually get them over the finish line of actually being able to raise that capital? And we can't solve for unconscious bias, right? But we can actually then create more, we can actually solve for a lot of the other things, and we can create more diversity in funding sources for them, which doesn't exist in the Pakistan market currently, in order to ideally help more women raise more capital.
That's incredible. I'm so excited to see all these programs come together. I know we've talked about the bank one. And so I'm very, very excited for that. Okay, so tying it all back together, the show is called Shaam Ki Chai. And so before we close it off, I'd love to hear about the Shaam Ki Chai traditions at your house. What did you guys eat? What did you guys talk about? What was it like? All the things. I want to know all the things.
So I guess I was just thinking, because when you were saying about having, chai, I was I'm not really a chai person, but obviously I grew up in Pakistan, so chai is very much part of my vernacular. Right. But I was thinking about what my tradition is right now, and I have actually become a tea person generally, but my way of winding down at night. So it's kind of become my way of relaxing. And so, there is a really wonderful tea place in Maryland, close to where my in-laws live, that sells beautiful loose leaf tea. And I've bought all these different types of them. And I have a teapot that I stew. And so it's kind of become part of my unwinding process. And then growing up as a kid, or even in Pakistan, even when I go back, even if I don't really drink chai, I do drink kava. I drink green tea. And that's a big tradition after dinner. That's a great way to digest your food. And so after you've had a great dinner with your family, you have your kava and just sit around and just chill out with your family. So I guess that was my tradition growing up, though I'm much more of a, I know this is very blasphemous to say on a Shaam Ki Chai show. I'm much more of a coffee person.
On a chai show of all things. No, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time and, sharing with us everything that you're doing and telling us about your journey. I'm really excited to just follow you're one of the women that I look up to. We're badass Pakistani women that I can just, look up to and become one day. And so thank you for
you're already doing it. So it's exciting to be in a community with all women like you as well. So I think that's what we need, right? Is to build this sisterhood of awesome women. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you, and we'll chat soon. Take care.
Thank you.